Welcome to our program on Kardec Radio.
Welcome, dear friends, to Kardec Radio in one more health and spirituality program. Did you know that's how we started Kardec Radio in 2011? With interviews with wonderful thinkers in this world who have these beautiful ideals and ideas that merge into the spiritist ideas as well. It's a beautiful thing to observe that the world is thinking what we're thinking about. Kardec was not the only one. You knew about it, right? Kardec it's not only us. There are many researchers who work skeptics, and one of them is Dr. Moody Jr. Raymond Moody Jr. will be joining us pretty soon, and he was 50 years ago, a little more than that, 52 years ago to be precisely. He was skeptic, he was an atheist, and doing research on near-death experiences, he found a new world. He has written 7 books, amongst them a bestseller, Life After Life. And you can find more information about him at lifeafterlife.com. If you go to the website, you're going to find a wealth of resources about him, his works, and much more, books, DVDs, courses. Fascinating. It's fascinating the much that he has been doing, and much in collaboration with other researchers as well. Yes, and we'll soon also have with us, joining our program later in December, one of his main collaborators, Lisa Smart, who wrote a fascinating book named Words at the Threshold. She researched on patients who are nearing death and open a new door for our understanding. And we are here at Kardec Radio preparing to receive Dr. Moody Jr. I can see he's here with us. And in a moment, we'll open to listen from here. It's been a while. The first time we met Dr. Moody Jr. was in 2006 in Maryland, when we were living in Maryland. And we organized an event with him and also Divaldo Franco. It was memorable. And later, we had the opportunity of interviewing him here at Kardec Radio. Before we had the video interviews, it was only audio. And you can access those fascinating interviews by going to SoundCloud Kardec Radio, and all the podcasts are under our program, Health and Spirituality, and you can access it all. Dr. Moody Jr. has been researching near-death experiences ever since. He is considered the father of the research of near-death experiences per se. And the most interesting part for us, especially during this pandemic, is that when he was researching it, he was a skeptic, he was an atheist, he discovered a new world. But not only for him, for everybody. The world that those people found out had an impact on him and in all of us, all the readers of his books. And today we are delighted that we're bringing him back. It's an honor for us at Kardec Radio to have him here with us. We have an open heart and much warmth to welcome him here, and feel free to ask your questions if you find that you would like to talk to him. He's here with us right now, and I'm welcoming him to join us. Thank you, Dr. Moody Jr. How have you been?
Hello, it's so good to see you again.
It's wonderful to see you and listen to you at the same time.
Yeah, this is great. What an amazing technology. You know, I've always been very good at extrapolation. When was a kid, I saw all sorts of things coming, but I never saw this, this internet thing that you can actually, when I was a kid, you would had to have a TV image. You had to have this huge machine in the studio, but now you can do it at home. That's pretty cool.
And now here we are. It seems that we are just seated in the same room together. And we're delighted to have you here and to see you striving during this pandemic. How has this pandemic been for you and your family, your loved ones?
Well, I worry about my kids and my grandson, and not so much about my wife. The husband-wife relationship, that's till death do us part, right? But in that context, you're most worried about your kids, right? And grandkids. So that's where my worry is. But, I really haven't been very upset by this myself. I mean, I certainly hope I don't get the COVID, because I'm not afraid of death, but I don't want to have trouble breathing. That's not my cup of tea. But in terms of, I know a lot of people are under stress for this, but actually, what surprises me about this is that this has taken so long. Even from back in the 70s and 80s, I used to think, knowing about of this society, it was a continuing miracle to me that it was holding together. So what really surprises me about this is that it's taken so long to happen, not that it's going on. Yeah,
it's very challenging for all of us, as you know, children nowadays are challenged because of schools closing, distance learning experiences. Parents have been affected, all of us in general, and of course the task force. So for you who have been doing this research on near-death experiences for more than 52 years, you've published bestseller books like Life After Life. And you were an atheist back then. And
what I would say more of an agnostic. My dad, when I was a kid, he had been in World War II as a medic, and he was a surgeon and a military officer. And if you put that kind of personality together, you can imagine how he was. And so, and that generation didn't talk, but when he came back from the war, I had to put it together later on in life that he was very sarcastic and hostile toward religious things. And to me, it just was whoops.
We can hear you, but we can see you somewhat.
I don't know what to do here. So maybe we should just go on talking. Is that okay?
Yeah, you can. That's okay.
Good. My son is Carter. My son is the expert on all this.
All right. That's good.
So
you have the privilege of having somebody around to help you out, right?
Yeah. But looking back at it, I realized that, that generation didn't talk. And probably what happened to him was that he was so traumatized by what he had seen in the war. He was in the Pacific Theater. And so I just grew up, I wasn't interested in religion. And it wasn't that I was an atheist. It's just, I guess I sort of assumed that you can't know whether there's a God or not. And my focus was on astronomy, number one. And also on nonsense. Since I was a kid, I've just been fascinated by language. I got my PhD in philosophy, and one of my special areas in it was philosophy of language. And so what I've always been interested in since I was a kid was Lewis Carroll and Alice in Wonderland and Dr. Seuss later on. And so when I was very young, I realized that the world doesn't make much sense. When I was looking through my telescope and realizing You can't make sense of this thing we're in. You ask yourself the question, how big is it? But either answer you can give seems impossible. Like you say, if your mind goes out to the wall, right? But then you say, but there's got to be something on the other side of a wall, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then the other option seems to be it goes on forever, and that's nonsense too. So I've always been very accepting of nonsense. But I went to UVA, University of Virginia, when I was in 1962. I was 18, and my intention was to become an astronomer. But reading Plato's Republic in my philosophy class, I got hooked and on philosophy, and I was a philosophy major. But Plato was the very first person I ever encountered who took the notion of an afterlife seriously. And what the Republic is about, in a way, because it culminates in this very dramatic near-death experience. And I got to talking with my professor about it, and he told me that these early Greek philosophers studied cases of people who were almost died and recovered. And that's how I got interested in this. But at the time, I knew about the philosophical debate, like Plato took it seriously and took these as indicators of an afterlife. But Democritus, about the same time, or a little earlier actually, studied these things too. And he said, oh, it's just the residual biological activity of the body. The same debate we have today. And so basically, it never occurred to me that this might be something other than an ancient Greek phenomenon. But 3 years later, I met Dr. George Ritchie. I think you've probably heard of him.
Yes.
And George was just a wonderful man. He was a professor of psychiatry at the university. And I heard his experience when I was an undergraduate. And I knew immediately that George was sincere. I mean, I didn't know what to make of his experience, and then I went on and was a philosophy professor for a while, went to medical school, and throughout this kept on hearing cases of this and have now heard thousands and thousands. I never, Dr. Anseloni, I never put any stock in that idea that this is oxygen deprivation to the brain. Because mainly on philosophical grounds, because in the real world, we just don't know what the relationship between the mind and the body is. If you go beyond conjecture on that, you're just fooling yourself. So I didn't know. But then also one of my own medical school professors told me about an experience she had when she was resuscitating her own mother unsuccessfully. But during this resuscitation, she herself got out of her body and saw her body and her mother's deceased body down below, and encountered the spirit, as she thought of it, or of her mother outside of her body, and saw this tunnel and light. And generally speaking, I've heard many others of those, but if it's oxygen deprivation to the brain, then why would a bystander who is not ill or injured have the same experience? So something else is going on than oxygen deprivation to the brain. It took me a long time to really, because I am inherently a skeptic. I still am. And skeptic doesn't mean what the people who organize themselves as skeptics, that they don't know what they're talking about, frankly. Because that point of view is actually humanism. It's my impression of all these so-called skeptics that I've met over the years. They really haven't studied philosophy. They don't know what a skeptic is. The skeptic movement goes back to Pyrrho, who was about 30 years after Aristotle. And the skeptical philosophy is a spiritual practice as much as anything else. But the skeptics knew all about logic, which is the technique for generating conclusions, right? But what they said is, well, what if we go through the reasoning process, but we don't make the conclusion? So you see, it's an idea that you withhold a conclusion. That's the technique. And so it works very effectively, because if you think about it, if everybody else is going in one direction to reach the conclusion, but you're withholding a conclusion, then what that does is that it opens up um, your peripheral vision, and you see side pathways that nobody's admits because they're heading in one direction to the conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
So if you read back what the so-called skeptics tell you, they say, oh, I'm a skeptic about these near-death experiences. I think it's just the chemistry of the brain. Well, that statement is a self-contradiction. It goes into saying, well, I'm a person who doesn't draw conclusions, and my conclusion is such and such. So those people don't know what they're talking about. But my skepticism is more that it is that, what's the hurry to draw a conclusion? And I think there's a inherent logical difficulty that in 2020 forbids us from drawing as a logical conclusion that there's an after. But I've got to admit, and that in my own life process, I've reached the point I can't draw a logical conclusion, but I give up. I don't know what else to say. I have so many medical doctor friends, for example, who've had profound near-death experiences. And every one of these people I know, I would trust my life with them as a I trust their medical judgment. And so it gets increasingly difficult to disagree with their unanimous opinion about what they experienced, that it was a reality. And also because I have so many physician friends who have empathically co-acted with the near-death experiences of their patients who've had near-death experiences. And it's like during the near-death experience of the patient, the doctor will have some interaction with it. And one that really sort of got to me some years ago was the case of an emergency room doctor who, while the patient was horribly injured in a car crash and his leg had to be amputated, and his wife was killed in an accident. And along with one of his children, another child survived. But while the patient was having a near-death experience in the hospital, the emergency room doctor told me that he was simultaneously conversing with the deceased wife of the man who was injured in the accident. So, at a certain point, it just gets to get the feeling, well, I give up. I don't know what else to say, except to my utter surprise, there does seem to be an afterlife.
That's so interesting. The whole rationale of how you're leading us to think about it. First of all, I want to mention to the public that if they want to hear an interview we had with you about Plato and Socrates in the past, a beautiful interview for us at Kardec Radio means so much, because Kardec said that Plato and Socrates were like forerunners of the Christian.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. This is absolutely correct. And it's amazing to me how little that knowledge is known among the Christian faith, because, for example, I read when I was an undergraduate philosophy student in 1964, I read Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy. And in there, Bertrand Russell points out that Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo, was the basis of the Christian theology of the afterlife. And that seems a startling, pronouncement, but I've asked numerous professors of religious studies about that, and they say, yeah, that's true. So, people who think that they can, probe into Christianity without knowing all about Plato and his ideas, they're just barking up the wrong tree.
Exactly. And it's fascinating because the way you're thinking. Recently, we were talking with some colleagues, and they are talking about what's happening in the world nowadays, the new generations. Much is happening at so many levels. And we said, it seems that somewhat many people lost their critical thinking.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Do you agree?
Oh my God. Yeah. I was logic and philosophy of language were some of my main areas in philosophy. And I love teaching logic. And people have reached the point where, they don't want to think.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, I don't want to get on a moral high horse here and be preaching. But what people are missing is fun. It's logic. It may sound like something dry, but if you want to think, then you need to learn logic, because logic makes thinking fun. It's very easy, as we see in the news every day, for people to fool themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the thing about people fooling themselves is that they're always unhappy, because by definition, self-deception, there's a part of you that knows that you're doing it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that makes people sort of uneasy, that and so they have to try to convince you, because they think that, well, if I can convince him, then maybe this internal discomfort I'm having will dissolve. But it doesn't work. No matter how many people you convert, it doesn't heal your own insecurities. But logic and thinking things through critically just makes inquiry a lot more fun. I can't say that in a way I'm moral about it, because, you look about what's happened today and the lack of critical thinking. Oh my God, people just decide they want to say anything that a charismatic figure says, and that's not happiness. Look at those people on TV today.
Yes.
Are they happy? No, with the red hats and all, they're not happy. And it's not that critical thinking makes you happy. It's just that number one, it is fun in itself. To me, there's no more fun in life than taking a very difficult problem and trying to work it out. By really going very strictly by the rules of reasoning. And then if you think it through, then what comes out of that process, if you try to cope with every objection and really think it through seriously, then what comes out on the other end, you can be more satisfied with. And then you have to put it to the public test, right?
Yes.
And let yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, because you were talking about something. So nowadays there is a huge thing about fake news.
Yeah.
And you were talking about that, how people buy into that.
Yeah.
So easily, to the point that they don't believe the truth, even if 10,000 venues say the truth.
They do. It's like it's immediate gratification, seems to me, at the base of the problem, that people want to sort of plug up a hole for the moment, and rather than looking at the whole structure. And something I really got to say too, that at the risk of sounding like a megalomaniac, I want to say that, and it's more as a sort of challenge, and this is a good group to do it with. I want to claim not to pat myself on the back or to propound a new belief system, but rather to try to get people to refute me. And that is that I claim that I have made a breakthrough in the genuine rational investigation of the afterlife question. And if I'm wrong, please, by all means, look at what I've worked out and see. And if you find a flaw in it, that would be wonderful, because then I would see the error in my own reasoning, right? Mm-hmm. But if I rather more expect, because I have subjected this to a lot of really brilliant scholars who agree that I'm right, then that gives me more confidence that I'm on the right track. But what I have done, Dr. Anseloni, is my interest in unintelligibility and nonsense goes back to childhood. And I did it, my doctoral dissertation in philosophy in 1969 had to do with this question. But, when you really get right down to it, to the real objectives, not the people say, oh, it's wishful thinking or what. Well, that's baloney, because I know a lot of people who positively wish that there isn't an afterlife, right? But the real deal was stated by David Hume, who said, by the mere light of reason, it seems difficult to prove the immortality of the soul. He said some new species of logic is required for that purpose, and some new faculties of the mind that they may enable us to comprehend that logic. Now, I want to say that I have solved Hume's problem. That what he's saying basically is that the mind we have and the logic we have aren't enough to tackle the afterlife question. And I think he's right. But what I've done is I've worked out a way around that. And the book that I've done, it was published recently by Llewellyn Press, and it's called Making Sense of Nonsense. It's based on a course that I taught for years at universities and all. I've had long experience teaching it. And it consists of text and exercises that people actually are printed in the book that you can actually go through. And what this does is that it takes you through a process where you see that you can think logically about things that don't make sense. And once you do, then how is this going to be related to the afterlife? I've realized a long time that the main problem that people with near-death experiences have is, as you know, ineffability, right? No matter how brilliant they are, no matter how many languages they speak, no matter how eloquent they are, they say, I just can't describe it to you. There are no words. Right? And I realized a long time ago, back in the 70s, that you can fix that there's a way of preparing your mind in advance so that subsequently, when you have a near-death experience, that will enable you to talk about it in an entirely new way. And I'm happy to say it has worked already once. I've been doing these seminars on nonsense and university courses on nonsense for many decades. And a few years back, a man who's an eminent artist and scientist took one of my seminars, and then a couple of years later, he developed H1N1, almost died. He was in the hospital for 60 days. He lost his leg to gangrene. He had 3 cardiac arrests and several near-death experiences. And during he was telling me about this, and his voice was very weak. He'd been through a terrible ordeal. But in the midst of this, his voice changed tone, and he said, and Raymond, he said, and when I was over there, he said, my mind went back to the seminar on nonsense. And he said, and I realized that what you're saying is true, that you can't comprehend how that world is connected to this world unless you take the unintelligibility axis into account. That's plainly a way a physicist would talk about it. But what I'm saying is, people should take seriously the fact that Dr. Seuss, and I'm glad you're sitting down, has sold 600 million books around the world. Now, what does that tell you? And look at Lewis Carroll, Through the Looking Glass, and Alice in Wonderland. And you're too young to remember, but I remember from childhood about doo-wop songs, which is sha-na-na-na-na, sha-na-na, which is a combination of nonsense used as the harmony or main line with intelligible parts, with the same structure as ancient shaman songs that enabled people to project their souls or minds over to the other side. People love Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong and their scat singing. People love playground rhymes from childhood. And so nonsense is a very powerful domain of language.
So
which
let me
has great spiritual connections as well.
Yeah, and that's one of our questions, because to the listeners here, just go to Life After Life or Amazon.com and you can grab a hold of the book, Making Sense of Nonsense, the logical bridge between science and spirituality. It's amazing how you make this connection. I don't think I've ever read anybody making a connection.
That's right. And it's because what I think, if I look back on all of the things I've discovered in my life, I think the main thing that I've discovered, and it's kind of shaped all the other things I've done, is that I've discovered a sort of cognitive flaw in our basic architecture of the way we think about things. And it has to do with the fact that, number one, people love nonsense. That's the fact. Think of playground rhymes, of nursery rhymes, of Dr. Seuss, of Lewis Carroll, and also of the many spiritual applications of it. Glossolalia in the Christian tradition, in the Zen Buddhism, the koans, what is the sound of one hand clapping, and so on. And so that's one set of facts. But the other fact is people don't like the word nonsense. It's a pejorative. And for many people, this is just too high a hurdle to get by, incredibly. But I know from my experience with the Kardec folks that this is a group that could get it, so that's why I'm saying, try this book out and see what you think, and let me know, because if there's a flaw in it, then I want to know what it is. But I've presented this reasoning to the most brilliant people I've ever known in my life, none of whom had any interest in the afterlife. Professors of logic and physics and engineering and business, psychology. And, I asked them to evaluate this very critically. And what people have come back and said is, this is that it's valid, that we can. Now, how does this relate to the near-death experience, for example? Well, when Lincoln was president, I think I read this when I was a kid in Carl Sandburg's biography. I think it's where I came across this. When Lincoln was president, he was in a very formal state ceremony. I forgot what it was all about. But his part in the ceremony called for him to mount a horse and to lead the procession away from this place. But when Lincoln got up on the horse picked its own back hoof up and got it caught in the stirrup. So the horse was, jumping around, and everybody in the crowd was just shocked into silence, like, oh, poor Mr. Lincoln, it's how embarrassing, So. But Lincoln just looked down at the horse and he said, well, if you're getting on, I'm getting off. And everybody just burst into laughter because, that's nonsensical to say that a horse can get on its own back by putting a hoof in the stirrup and climbing aboard. But nonetheless, it raises a very vivid image in your mind, right? And that's not what nonsense can do with us. Now, let's think of the near-death experience. What are the main things that people say? Number one, they say, I don't have any words for it. This is far beyond my power of words. And number two, that it was not in time, right? People say, I saw everything I'd ever done in my life in a panorama, but no time passed, right? And they also say that it doesn't occur in the space like we experience here, that it's a non-spatial experience, okay? And so then what people say is that the best I can say is that I got out of my body, I went through a tunnel into a light, I met my deceased relatives, I saw my life pass in review, I returned to my body and came back to life. That's a travel narrative, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, the way we understand the meaning of a travel narrative is the concepts of time and space. See, so the accounts we have of near-death experiences are analogous to that joke that Lincoln said, right? They're saying something that really doesn't make any sense, but nonetheless it makes sense. And that's all right. You see, in science, nonsense is a placeholder. That is, it's something we hold on to in the expectation that eventually we're going to figure it out. In science, I guess the main thing now is, well, the two most powerful explanatory theories ever are, number one, the general theory of relativity, and number two, the quantum theory, right? But the difficulty is, as you can ask any physicist about this, it's that when you combine the two sets of equations, you get nonsense. Right? That's the sticking point right now. That wonderful Japanese-American physics professor from NYU, I forgot his name. Oh my goodness. He was pointing this out on one of his documentaries recently. He's just such a great guy. You would recognize him if I just can't think of his name. But you know, this is what physicists say. Now, go back in your mind to 1915 and be a very articulate and well-educated person in 1915, okay? And now listen to the following three sentences. Sentence number one: all four of Ethel's grandparents perished and were lost in a shipwreck long before her mother and father were born, right? That is totally unintelligible in 1915. Right? Just makes no sense. But now add the subsequent knowledge of the role of DNA in heredity, the development of gene transplant, you know, gene engineering, and genetic engineering, cloning. And it hasn't happened yet, but we can imagine a scenario of sending down a probe and getting the DNA from the bone and, you know, clone, so on. So something that was unintelligible in 1915 is now intelligible. Or listen to this from the perspective of somebody in 1915. Two women got married to each other at City Hall yesterday. Unintelligible. Now it's the law of the land. Or listen to this one. I watched a movie on my phone this morning. See, so unintelligibility is a changeable thing. So in 2020, the concept of life after death is unintelligible, and it's to acknowledge that is the first thing we need to do to get to an eventual proof. But what I'm saying, and I'm quite confident about this, which is, you know, I mean, because I've worked on it so long, but we now have a method. We can solve Hume's problem. We have a new logic not one to replace the one we have, but a new logic of principles that tell us what to do when we come up against something that's unintelligible.
It's so interesting.
I've learned from teaching this to many students. What they say is that these exercises open up faculties of your mind that you didn't know you had.
And that's the thing I want to ask you about, because we in Spiritism, since Kardec's time, the literature we have been facing, especially the one that came through this medium here, Chico Xavier, I have the picture behind him. He, such a prolific psychographer, almost 500 books. And the language in those books, so fascinating, but so high up that for many people, it may seem unintelligible. So being a neuroscientist, I have this question because we know that there's so much potential to be unfolded in the future of humanity. So would you say, based on what you're talking about, nonsense, the base is the nature of nonsense, as you write in your first chapter, being that it's something that is unintelligible maybe now?
Yes.
like in the Bible, if I go back to Jesus' time, some of the things like the camel in the needle, it's like for
Yeah.
us today doesn't make any sense.
That's right. That's
Right?
right.
Would you say
Absolutely.
that in the future we will potentially gravitate to understand more about studies like yours, life after life?
I am absolutely sure of it. I don't know the time scale.
Mm.
But what I do know, because I've reasoned it out and I put it to test, is that, and I think anybody who reads that book, and I'm asking people to read it critically, because if somebody can find a hole in what I've said, then I would thank them, because that would lead me closer to the truth. But what I'm getting at is that, and generations of students that I've taught this, people have said that it has enormous influences on their subsequent life. It's not the only implication of this book that, that a new way of studying the afterlife. It has implications for advertising, for example, and for psychology, for medicine. When I went to medical school in 1972, and I had already been studying nonsense for a long time, and I realized that that there's different types of nonsense, and I'd realized that in reading Dr. Seuss and Lewis Carroll, and I'd sort of cataloged them. But when I began to go on the wards as a medical student, um, uh, what I realized when I went into the ward is that a lot of sick patients talk nonsense. When people are delirious, for example, as any doctor will know, delirious people just go on and on and on nonsensically. Or people you meet in the emergency room who were in it saw a terrible accident. They weren't themselves injured, but they came in to support the injured person or whatever. When you try to get a straight story, they don't talk sense. I mean, people under severe stress, people talk nonsense. Or psychotic people. Like schizophrenics, for example, make up meaningless nonsense words. And so what I realized was that the types of nonsense that I heard from my medical patients were the same types of nonsense that Dr. Seuss and Lewis Carroll had written deliberately. So what I realized is that deliberate or involuntary nonsense is nonsense. It has its own structure. And not only that, that even though if you think of this horizontal line in front of you, most people think of nonsense as something sublinguistic, like is below the level of that line. In reality, nonsense is something up above the level of ordinary meaningful language because it has a more complicated structure. Like nonsense, meaningful language, you can analyze by just saying which rules it follows. If you try to analyze nonsense, you have to take into account not just which rules it follows, but which rules it breaks. So that's why nonsense is a more complicated form of language than ordinary meaningful language. And I think that's why it has played such a big role in the spiritual traditions of humankind. I have tried glossolalia myself. I have not in the context of a religious ceremony or anything. Glossolalia consists of nonsense syllables drawn from the speaker's own language and put together without any grammatical form or any meaningful combinations, associated more with the Pentecostal faiths and so on. But what I found from my own self-experimentation is that you don't need to be in a religious ceremony to do it. All you need to do is just to eliminate your inhibitions and let yourself do it spontaneously. And you don't need an ecstatic state of consciousness to start it. However, what I found is that if you continue it a little while, you do get into a really fascinating ecstatic state of consciousness. So, and the same for koans. That's why, the point of a koan is to just try to approach an illogical or nonsensical question by logic. And what that eventually does is that it flips you out of the entirely logical mode of consciousness into another state.
So where is mediumship in that? When you're talking about that, where is mediumship in that?
Dr. Anseloni, I got to admit, on mediumship, I just don't know. I just
Okay.
don't. I have some friends who are mediums and so on, and so I don't know. For example, if you know Suzanne Giesman, yeah, and it's like Suzanne. All right, she was on the National Security Agency. I think she was the first woman to command a U.S. naval vessel in sea. And she just some years back began to hear from dead people. And so she went down to Florida, and she's now a medium. And so I asked Suzanne one time, I said, Suzanne, what did your people in the national security apparatus, what did your friends in the national security think when you told them that you were talking to dead people? And she leaned forward and she said, they were fascinated. Right? And I am too, but I don't know.
Okay, that's okay. Because
One thing I do know is that something that may seem nonsensical in one context can later on become sensical.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's exactly why we're asking you, because to some people it may sound nonsensical. For example, when I see somebody who has no school whatsoever, and like this medium in Brazil, Chico Xavier, who was so not only a humanitarian but a unique medium, and he wrote these books with deep knowledge, foreseeing even advancements in science. And then you think, for many people at a time, you're like, but science hasn't said this yet. And some were skeptical until science proved so many things. Like, for example, for me as a neuroscientist, he wrote a book in 1958 that says that the neurons can renew themselves. Back then, it wasn't this way until 2002, when Fred Gage in California proved it for the first time, that it's a possibility in aging brains. So then you say, where did that come from?
Yeah. And the whole thing of creativity. And to me, creativity in itself is a paranormal phenomenon. I mean, where does that come from? In the ancient Greeks, they thought of creativity as a contact with the muse, right? And in reality, modern day artists say the same thing. I mean, I've talked to so many artists who say, this doesn't come from inside of me. It's they will point up above themselves and say, I have that same experience in my writing and so on. I'm a comedian for a while. I don't know if you know that, but it's like you just open yourself up and all this stuff comes through from somewhere else.
Yes.
And so I think that let me tell you a story that this is one of the most meaningful spiritual events in my life. I have this wonderful son, Carter, and Carter is now 22, and we adopted him at birth from Kerrville, Texas. He's Mexican American by heritage, and we had been praying that God would send us just the right adoptive situation. So we met this wonderful family from Kerrville in April of '98, and we went down there and made a bond with them. And then we were there for the birth, and my wife Cheryl was the first person to hold Carter when he was delivered. And so then, the baby stays in the hospital for 3 days is the norm. And so on the third day, Carter was born July 20th, 1998. And so on the day that he was released from the hospital, my wife and Carter in his little baby seat and I went to a local restaurant there in Kerrville with the birth family, Carter's birth mother and her parents, right? So we were all sitting there in the restaurant and having lunch, and the gist of the conversation was that Carter will always know of his birth family, And in the fullness of time, we'll be getting back together and so on. And so in the midst of this conversation, I looked up and there was a placard on the wall that had a nonsensical message on it. And this was what the message said: closed. I have gone out to find myself. If I should arrive before I return, please hold me till I come back. Now think about that. 11 years later, it happened just like that. The whole family came and stayed a week with us, and Carter got to know his birth family. So you see, what that indicates to me is that nonsense can be a kind of interdimensional form of communication, right?
It's like you're decoding a message.
Yes, yeah. That the placard was nonsense. It's nonsense to say closed. I've gone out to return to find myself. If I should, arrive before I return, please hold me till I come back. That's nonsense. But it was exactly the situation we were in. We were talking about how Carter is now our baby and we're going to raise him, but he'll always know about his birth family, and the fullness of time we'll get back together. And it's exactly what happened. But I bet a lot of people listening to this have had that same kind of experience. Where something that was nonsensical in one framework, later on, they realized that it made perfect sense.
Yeah. And it's interesting you're saying this, because I can't refrain from saying that when we, like, for example, on Netflix, there is a movie about Kardec and how he started it all. Back then, the spirit phenomena that were happening in France, Paris, France, made no sense to many people. Yeah. They were just for fun. And that's why we call him a codifier, because he saw things that were nonsensical and he made sense of it. In your way of thinking, that's how it is.
Yes. It's like people say, for example, Aristotle said that there were occasional reports of rocks falling from the sky, right? But Aristotle said that rocks can't fall, stones can't fall from heaven because there's no stones in heaven to fall. Right? Well, then finally the evidence became overwhelming but at one time, allegedly, Thomas Jefferson, a meteorite fall occurred in New Haven, Connecticut back in the early 1800s, and two professors from Yale went out and collected the pieces and wrote a paper. And so the paper, since Jefferson was an eminent scientific man of his day, the journal sent a copy of the article to Jefferson and asked for his comments. And he said, "Gentlemen, I had rather believe that those two Yankee professors would lie than believe that stones fell from heaven." And you see, that was the rational point of view. Who could be more rational than Thomas Jefferson at that time? So, when a question arises that is such monumental importance as the afterlife question,
yes,
and it doesn't respond to our standard means of logical inquiry, one possible alternative is to come up with a new way of looking at things that does make it make sense.
Yes.
And that's what I think I've done. I mean, I may be wrong, and I'm happy to receive correction, but
no,
I think that as time goes on, people say, yeah, that's right, that we can prepare our minds in advance to talk about our near-death experiences in a new way when they happen subsequently.
Dr. Moody Jr., I have two questions that I can't close the program before asking you these two questions. One of them is about, because I see your latest book as a way to go to the public that hasn't absorbed some evidences, because you brought evidences, not only, the rationale about it. And and you're reaching out to them, especially at this critical time. How do you see people nowadays because of this pandemic? Thousands of people are dying daily in the United States alone. And we would expect that people would, in the midst of all this chaos, look for answers, look for ways of understanding why this is going on. Do you see any of that happening?
Well, I don't know. I have honestly had the thought at times that maybe this American thing about immediate gratification has just gone so far that it's not correctable. And I hope I'm wrong about that. But generally speaking, as we both know, in this kind of societal torment and turmoil, a lot of people do start turning to the spiritual. And just from past experience, I would guess that has to be happening, wouldn't you think? I mean, just because it's always happened in the past that when there's been great turmoil like this, that it's turned a lot of people to the spiritual life. So I haven't seen any evidence of it yet, but I imagine it's happened just because it's been such a regular thing in the past.
Mm-hmm. And since you are so deep into philosophy, or you have taught so much about it and logics, and recently in our study groups, we have been talking about the importance of teaching critical thinking at early stages in education, because we're waiting for college to people be immersed in it, and it seems like we're not getting into it.
Yes.
What do you think?
I think absolutely true. I mean, that's just, logic. It's so much fun. I got to say, I wish I had some noble purpose and for my work, but the most fun thing to do, if you want to think, the most fun thing to do is to think by the rules, because if you just try to put together a flimsy argument just to make it turn out like you want, you know that deep down that it's just baloney. But if you learn the rules and then really try to find, what I have always wanted to know is, I've never entertained the idea that I want to know that there is life after death. What I've always wanted to know is whether there's life after death. But I see a lot of people who want to know that there's life after death, and once they get into that, it's hopeless after that, right? But if you start with the question, C.S. Lewis said something very profound, and I think I can come up with it pretty accurately. He said, if you look for truth, you may find consolation in the end.
Wow.
But if you look for consolation, you will get neither truth nor consolation.
Wow.
But only trivialities at first and despair in the end. And I think that's true. Look at society now. All these people who are under the influence of a charismatic figure, a personality cult,
Yeah. Very dangerous.
Very dangerous.
Very dangerous. Very dangerous. We are at the edge of a very critical moment in our nation, but we hope for the best. And we think that at the basis of it all is a major educational gap. Probably when we're not teaching soon enough critical thinking to our children, we wait too long, and many of them don't go into college to actually.
That's right.
Access
and I think the way to do it is to make it fun. You can make critical thinking fun. I've done it. That's my students always loved my logic courses because you don't have to be dry about it. It's fun.
I can see you writing these books for children, because when you say thinking is fun, I can see like the cover page of this book by you to children, because that's what we need. That's what we need. It's a social matter right now to help people think again.
Yeah.
Right? To boost it up.
Absolutely.
And this is all about Kardec. Kardec used to say, if we don't reason our faith, blind faith doesn't go anywhere.
That's right. And Socrates said, the unexamined life is not worth living. And then, that's just so obviously true, isn't it? It's
Yes,
like,
it is.
I've noticed that, and I'm sure you too in your own process have noticed that when people get to be about 50 years old, they naturally start wondering about who was this Plato guy and Socrates. It's like when you're a kid, you may say, oh, that's abstract or whatever, but it's just a developmental phase that people go through about the age of 50 or 60. This naturally awakens in them. They want to know about these origins. And I have this wonderful friend who's a general in the Air Force and a cardiologist and I think a PhD in organic chemistry. I mean, I was with him around his 50th birthday, and we were talking about our background. And I said, well, I studied philosophy. And my friend just said, I wish so much I'd studied philosophy. And people do that when they're about 50 or 60. And so, but now that's dropped out of the curriculum, right? We've abandoned the classical education model, but those people who are deprived of that now may feel good because, oh, I don't have to learn all that stuff. But when they get 50, they're going to be so angry at the college for not telling them all this stuff.
Yes, I agree with you. And this book, Making Sense of Nonsense, is fascinating. We would recommend to the public. As you say, it's not only about thinking critically about what you've put together, but you write it so well. And it's such a delight to hear you because people can get the in the audiobook format as well.
Okay.
Right? So, I'm so sorry we have to finalize the interview, Dr. Moody.
Well, we are in a world of time, Vanessa, but when we're out of this place, we won't have that factor, but for now, that's where we are.
But I have to say, it's a blessing to have you here with us because we could take whole courses, but I know that you, in your website, there are courses people can take, right?
Yeah, there are. I just love teaching, and I know you do too. Yeah, it's great. And I'm just so happy to be with you again. You're just such a delightful person.
Thank you so much, and we hope to stay in touch. We recommend to the public to read this book and all the books, 7 books, Since After Life. Just go to lifeafterlife.com and get to know more of the books. And Dr. Moody, would you like to make a final statement before we wrap up the program?
Well, I would, because I know, from a long experience with the Kardec folks, I know that you guys are genuinely interested in reasoning and figuring out the big philosophical and spiritual questions. And so I'm just so delighted to be with you. And so I just want to say thank you so much for listening today. And I just wish I could get to know all of you personally. So thank you so much for listening in.
Thank you so much. And we want to give you a warm hug and wish you a beautiful new year because we're around the corner from a new year. We hope it's going to be better year for all of us, right?
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr.
And love to all the people listening. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. So, friends, we have so much to thank Dr. Moody Jr. for being here with us. I know we couldn't see him all throughout the interview, but hearing him is a delight for us. It's so good to hear somebody who so wise and who thinks so logically and leads us into the adventures of thinking, the delight. It's a human ability we need to cherish. And we love when he says thinking can be fun and is fun. And today we had this wonderful opportunity. We want to thank everybody who has been here with us. A loving hug to all of you. And don't forget, go to the website, lifeafterlife.com, and rejoice with the resources. Because here we have, I would say, in our language here at Kardec Radio, a missionary on earth. Dr. Raymond Moody Jr. is one of these missionaries on the earth who has been making a huge difference, boosting critical thinking in people, but especially about the essence of life. And we would say there's so much to learn. He has courses as well. Go there, check it out. There's much to learn. After all, thinking is fun. I got it. So friends, we love being here with you. Thank you for watching. And until next Saturday, in one more Health and Spirituality. Thank you, friends.